with the two tablets of stone that the message was go and preach the Ten Commandments to all creation. That really is not right. This was given to the people of Israel to govern their relationship first with God and then with one another.
And in the one another standpoint, you think about it again. We've discussed this before, but they were becoming a nation. They were a nation who needed laws to follow. Much like we are a nation who have laws and Congress which passes laws and certain penalties that go along with those laws. And that was needed for the children of Israel to govern them. And so it would have taken far more than just 6 commandments here, right, to encompass all that they would need in regards to culturally being guided by law.
Well, one of the questions that has to be raised is, what if you break these commandments? What is there any consequence? Like when it says, you shall not murder. Okay, is there any penalty for that? You see, based on this commandment, God has more to say about it. When it says, you shall not commit adultery, God has more to say about it. So that's the basis of these moral principles that are set forth in these last 6 about our relationship with one another. But when these things are violated, the rest of the book of Exodus and other places in the Old Testament talk about consequences if these things are violated. And so you cannot take these 10 commandments without taking the others that are based on these.
Yeah, and even as we talk about these commandments tonight in relation to one another as well, the different levels of things that might happen, well, if this happens and this happens, this would be the penalty, and if it happens this way, this would be the penalty. Again, those are things that we see in our own justice system today, and thus would be the case here. Sometimes you think, boy, I'm going to have to get a whiteboard out, make some notes so I can try to figure out what happens. Well, that's much like what juries might have to do today, or to determine what happens in a case, that not all death to another is created equal, is it? That there is murder, there's a murder one, there's manslaughter, there's different things in our culture, and it would have been the same in their culture.
Sure. Well, any more about the 10 Commandments? Any questions about the 10 Commandments? I would mention that 9 out of these commandments, 9 of these 10 commandments are restated in one form or another under the new covenant. What is the one, though, that is specifically excluded for new covenant people? The Sabbath. Yeah, Colossians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. What day of the week is the Sabbath? It's Saturday. Someone says, well, under the new covenant, it was changed to Sunday. Book, chapter, and verse, please.
Sunday is not the Sabbath, and
it's
that
not.
Is important to
the Sabbath is
important
Saturday.
to remember.
It's
The Sabbath
been,
was a commemoration of something different than what we commemorate today. Well, let's get to Brother Arsenault, and then we'll dig into that.
Yeah, most of the religious world doesn't even understand that this was part of Moses' law and is not new covenant law. And you'd think that guys who go to seminary for 4 years, then go on to get their master's degree and their doctor's degree, you'd think they would at some point pick up on that. But Jerry, at the seminary, they teach primarily denominational doctrine rather than just teaching the Bible. Not to say those men don't learn any Bible, but it is very common for men who have doctorate degrees to fail to understand the distinction between the two covenants. The most basic of all Bible lessons, Jerry, is to understand the difference between the old covenant given at Sinai and the new covenant that was inaugurated and initiated by the blood of Jesus at the cross. The cross is the dividing point. The book of Colossians shows that it was at the cross that the new covenant began. The book of Hebrews shows that it was at the cross that the old covenant came to an end. And that's the most fundamental Bible lesson. One of the things that we did in teaching the kids over at Vincent Middle School when we were teaching over there on Wednesday morning, I would teach the kids about the difference between the two covenants. And I would say to a 12-year-old boy or girl, now, you know something that your preacher probably doesn't know. And their eyes would get big because they thought their preacher knew everything. But he didn't understand the difference between the two covenants. So we tried to help people understand This is a fundamental Bible lesson. And Greg, we mentioned the Sabbath. Question number 11, in the giving of the Ten Commandments, what was the basis for keeping that Sabbath day? Who can tell me? Who can tell us? Yeah, it harkens back to the 6 days of creation, and then on the seventh day, God rested. And here the Sabbath is given on that basis. The first time, I think we mentioned this the other day, the first time we ever see the Sabbath observed was in the picking up of the manna. There is no reference to the Sabbath being observed prior to that. There are people who say, oh yeah, it was observed by Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. No, there's no evidence for that whatever. Here in the giving of the Ten Commandments, we find the basis of it was the day of rest that God chose. And so he told his people he wanted them to rest on the seventh day, on Saturday.
And so what is the big deal really, though, if we just say, well, Sunday is our Sabbath? I mean, it's just words, Max. Does it really matter? And what would you say to that? Does it really matter? If you're shaking your head that it matters, well, tell me why. Why does it matter? It matters. I agree with you. It matters. Why does it matter? We're commanded to keep the first day of the week, and we keep this day for a different reason. Why? Why are we here upon the first day of the week? Christ rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And so the significance is not the same as the Sabbath. It's not just words. The Sabbath in Scripture had a purpose. It had a commemoration that was behind it. And the first day of the week, under our covenant, as Max has plainly stated, the second covenant that we live in under the new covenant, the first day of the week is very significant because God has made it significant in our covenant because our covenant was sealed by the blood of Christ, and he arose on that day. And so it's not just words. So when people say, "Oh, I just call it that," well, let's call the right thing, right? Let's use Bible words for Bible thoughts. Yes.
Bible words in Bible ways.
Yeah.
That's like someone says, "Well, we gave our tithes and offerings last Sunday." You may have given an offering, but tithing was again part of the law. Someone says, "Well, brother, let me ask Pastor Max." And while it's true that I'm a pastor, when people call me pastor, they're thinking denomination pastor. So let's use Bible terms, Bible ways, and not help to feed the error that's out there in the world.
Yeah, great point. Let's look at question number 12. What was the promise that accompanied the law about honoring their father and mother? Prolong their days. Go ahead, Max.
Well, I'll just say this. Let me ask you all the question. What kids do best in this world? Is it those who fight their parents and resist them at every point? Or is it those who are submissive to their parents? What do you think? You know, yeah, I learned from my parents and sometimes learned the hard way what I was supposed to do in life. And maybe some of you did that too, so don't laugh at me, okay? But when we obey our parents, it often keeps us out of trouble, Greg. And that's the point. That's the point being made. Your chances of a long life are better if you honor your father and your mother.
It's not a guarantee from God that you're going to live a long life if you honor your father and mother. And if something happens to a child early in life, it's not a punishment for not honoring their father and mother. It's just, again, it's a guiding principle.
Well, that's right. It's what's called a maxim.
A max, okay. I was wondering what that word was.
A maxim is a rule that is generally true but may not apply in absolutely every circumstance. Okay.
And because you've got other Bible passages, time and chance happens to all. I mean, there are other things that can happen. The free will of man can affect us, but certainly I think that is the idea that honoring your father and mother gives you the best chance at living along. Just like honoring God gives us what? I'll tell people, you want to stay out of jail? Honor God, right? I mean, God's guiding principles keep us out of trouble in this world, keeps us out of jail, keeps us out of all kinds of trouble if we just follow God's will. And so it's a good principle. Yeah. There were some more immediate, consequences were there in the old law. Well, let's shift down to the end of page 34, and let's start looking at some of the various laws, beginning here with number 13, question 13, out of Exodus chapter 20, verses 22 through 26. The question is, how does God make Israel worship different from that of all of the nations around them in these passages? How is their worship different? Who worshiped idols? Others worshiped idols, right? Yeah, the others worshiped idols. The Israelites weren't worshiping idols. That would make their worship different. What other thoughts might you have? What's the difference in a natural stone and a hewn stone? What's the big deal about making a hewn stone, shaping it? Okay, God said not to. Why? Why do you think God said that? I mean, maybe I just wanted to square off the corners, make it look a little neater.
Yeah, maybe I just want to square off the corners a little bit and then maybe carve the face of a calf on the face of it.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right. That's exactly the point, is one thing leads to another, and then all of a sudden, what do you have? You don't have an altar. You have graven images and idols. Exactly.
Yeah,
All right.
the interesting thing here, Greg, is that the Israelites worshiped a God that they could not see. And all of the pagan nations worshiped gods that they could see, gods that were made with their own hands out of wood, stone, or metal.
I put in my notes that altars were made for were made. Let me see this again. Altars are for sacrifices, and I guess meaning that by that they're used in worship. They were used for worship, but they were not to be worshipped, which is a very different thing than the graven image. All right. Well, what happened to what was the law according to Exodus 21 verses 1 through 6? What was the law of Hebrew slaves in this passage? I read through this. Let's read through this passage, chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. There's a lot of specifics here given here, and what ifs and if this, right? Now, these are the rules that shall be set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. There's a lot of different rules here, and as we read through that, I can very easily see in our culture us going, I don't think I like that. I don't think I like those laws. And in our culture, we can understand that, but God had very specific laws about how this should be, and that was God's law on the matter. It was God's law on the matter. And I think, too, when we look at, I've had questions about this, about slavery in the Bible and God condoning slavery. I think we have to recognize that I think this was very different than what we might know in the history of our country. Those are not the same things. The terms are the same. They sound the same, but they're not the same thing.
I believe about a year and a half or nearly 2 years ago, Brother David and Brother Ben did a lesson together, I think, on slavery. It's probably the best thing you could find about slavery in the Bible. And it dealt with so many of the misconceptions. Actually, these laws and the laws that are going to follow in the next 2 or 3 chapters were given for the protection of people so that they would not be treated improperly. And I guess the thing that stuck out to me was if the slave says, look, I love my master, I want to stay here. Pierce his ear with an awl. That would be like there would be an earring then that would be put in his ear that says that he is chosen to stay with his master. And so just like women have pierced ears today, it was something like that. In fact, it was not uncommon, Greg, for the Israelites to wear earrings. Remember the golden calf. They're going to have to pull out some of their earrings to give to the people. So that was, or to give to Aaron. That was kind of a common thing. Also, the purpose, how a person got to be a slave. this was not, what he's talking about here is not going out and kidnapping someone to make them a slave. In fact, chapter 21 speaks against kidnapping, this same chapter. This is someone who buys a Hebrew slave. And it was often the case that people found themselves deep in debt and they had no way to get out of their debt. And so they would sell themselves into a slave situation for 6 years. And then at the end of 6 years, you're free. Your debt is over. And you were, during that time, you, of course, were fed and clothed and housed, just like anyone else would be. But a man was not to be kept as a slave for life unless he chose to be a servant in that household. So again, these things were given to protect people.
We had a couple of hands real quick before we move along. Yes, sir? Yeah. Lots of laws out there throughout the years that were based on just what we read about in the book of Exodus. Did I see another hand over here before we moved? Yeah.
I think it's important to note how many people were slaves in Bible day. And you see, well, of course, Joseph is one good example. And he was a man who conducted himself properly and was elevated. But when you get to the time of the Roman Empire, the numbers vary a little bit, but from somewhere from 75% to 85% of the people who lived in the Roman Empire were slaves. This week we're reading from Acts chapter 16. Remember when Paul was beaten at Philippi? Remember, and put in jail? And then when the magistrates learned that he was a Roman citizen, now they realized they were in trouble. They weren't beating some slave. And so Roman citizenship was something that was highly coveted. And about 8 out of 10 people who lived in the empire were slaves. They were not regarded as citizens. And so you see how widespread slavery was. It was just the way things were in Bible days. And here, God put regulations on it, said you can't keep this guy beyond 6 years. If he indentures himself to you, 6 years is the limit.
All right, well, we're not going to take the time to read these next 16 verses about murder and all these different scenarios. The question was, what clarifications and explanations does God give about this? Did you have anything that jumped out at you that you wanted to comment on about these 16 verses as it relates to murder and the punishment? Yep. Certainly kidnapping is included in there. There's just a host of scenarios. It's much like we said earlier, they're not all the same. And God lays out all of these scenarios, much like we would have in our culture and in our legal system for taking into account the various things that might occur. Who was responsible? Yeah. Ooh. That thin them out quick. Yes. Well, sometimes we ignore laws and punishments, don't we? We think only in the moment, and we don't really think about what's down the road. Sure.
You know, one of the comments I would like to make on this, Greg,
Sure.
is it does mention in verse number 14 premeditated murder, and then it mentions kidnapping in the next verse. And people to say, well, the death penalty, in the state of Texas, in the prison, that violates the principle of murder. It says you should not murder. So here it's legalized murder. It is obvious that when God says in verse 14 of chapter 21, if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, God says, you shall take that man from my altar that he may die. The penalty for violating commandment number 6 up there on verse 13, if you commit murder, premeditated murder, you are to be put to death. And so the problem here is people say, well, but it's wrong. Well, why is it wrong? Is it wrong to put someone to death for murder? This was God's standard under the old law. By the way, there's similar text in Romans chapter 13 that says the same thing about the new covenant, about the government does not bear the sword in vain. But if you take away the penalty, then what happens to the law? And by the way, all killing was not the same. Not every time you took someone's life was it regarded as murder. There was an accidental death that we'll see later. Accidental death. You don't put someone to death because they've had an accident and accidentally killed someone. And so, but for the crime of murder, for the crime of kidnapping, there indeed the death penalty was there.
All right. Any other thoughts or comments about this before we turn the page to page 35? Yeah.
David, God has never placated children who were rebellious against their. This goes back to the commandment number 5, honor your father and mother, and that's something, even if your father or mother might be harsh or any number of things, they are still your father or mother. And I was raised by a dad who was very hard, but I loved my dad in spite of that. I miss him today. We'll say that. I learned a lot of important lessons from a father who was maybe harsher than he should have been, and with my brother, my sister. But it is a right thing to honor your parents simply because they are your parents.
Yeah. My daughter will tell you about that hallway back there growing up. She knew what that meant. She knew what the foyer meant. The foyer didn't mean we're going to go back there and play for a while. The foyer meant I'm about to get a spanking before we go back in and sit down and be quiet. And that's the way it was. And I can remember one time an elderly lady in the back came up to me and she goes, I can't believe it. Well, that's the way it is, And I think she turned out pretty good. So,
Amen.
Discipline was always part of God's plan, whether it be discipline towards children, whether it be murder and repaying eye for an eye here as we read. And the next question 17 at the top of page 35 is really not any different as it relates to the damage to a baby in the womb. What's the principle? If the damage to the child, but there's no harm done, it causes premature birth, but no harm done, what's the penalty? There's a fine, right? There's a fine. But if it causes harm, causes the death of the child, life for a life. So that penalty is laid out there for us. And then we shift gears a little bit. We talk about, we jump ahead really to Exodus chapter 23, and we talk about the festivals. Did I miss anything else, Max, you wanted to cover? Oh, yeah. Sure.
The law that does not have a penalty attached to it ceases to be a law. Someone says, no, the law is still there. But if there's it's like the law of gravity. If you climb up on this building and you step off the roof of the building and nothing happens, you just kind of float out there, well, then that's because the law of gravity ceases to exist. But when you violate the law of gravity, you're in trouble. And there's a penalty attached to violating it. And it's that way with all law. The speed limit, I believe, out here in front of the building is 40 miles an hour. Is that right? 40 miles an hour. What if people consistently drive like they do on Major Drive, 80 miles an hour? If people drive 80 miles an hour in front out here and the police just wave at folks as they go by, then the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit ceases to exist because it is never enforced. Law that's never enforced and no penalty is attached to it, it ceases to be a law. That's just axiomatic that it's that way. So these laws that God had They had penalties attached to it. That's the point of all these 3 or 4 chapters and all these other commandments that came after the 10. Right?
So let's move on to the Sabbath. Question number 18. What was the law of the Sabbath? We've talked about it a little bit. We talked about it a lot maybe already, but tell me quickly. It's on the seventh day. What did you see in here that you thought was even another kind of interesting concept that came out of this section? It talked about not just on the seventh day that the people were to rest. Okay, animals, servants, but even in the seventh year, what was to happen? The land was to rest. Even in the seventh year, the land was to get that year of rest and replenishment so that it could be productive. I think that's interesting. That's a part of this as well. And I think it would have been a law that it's not just, hey, farmer, that's a pretty good idea. It was the law that had to be done. All right. So then he talks about festivals. What were the 3 festivals that God described here? Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Okay, Feast of the Harvest. Feast of the Ingathering. What were those about? What was the Feast of...
Go ahead.
Okay. What was the Feast of the Unleavened Bread?
That's Passover, yeah.
Passover.
Someone said it.
Okay, Passover, right. And the Passover. So unleavened bread for 7 days. Actually given even the month in which that would have occurred. Feast of the Harvest. What was that about? Okay, the first crops. Offering of the first fruits of the labor, the first crops that would have come in.
Also known as Pentecost, the Feast of Pentecost.
I'm going to write that in my notes.
Then you've got one more, the Feast of what? Ingathering, which was also called the Feast of Tabernacles. Thank you. Yeah, Feast of Tabernacles. And so these, while those 3 names are not found here, they're found in Numbers, they're found in Leviticus, and of course they're found in the New Testament, consistent with these. And what was the unusual thing about these feasts, Greg? All the Jewish men had to come to Jerusalem. That's the way it turned out. They had to come to where the place of worship was, which eventually was Jerusalem.
Any questions on these feasts, these 3 feasts, before we move along? All right, what was the law of the conquest as seen in Exodus chapter 23? I believe that should be 20 through 33, not 2 through 33.
Right.
What was the law of conquest there?
I thought that question was a little ambiguous.
Okay.
Did anyone answer it?
Did.
I mean, there was a typo there. The 0 was left off the 2. What did you answer, Greg?
Well, now I'm starting to question myself after that, but I just thought that the law of conquest was the idea that they were to fully overthrow the people and not make covenants or peace treaties with them, but to fully overthrow, and if they failed to do so, they would adopt their bad habits. I thought that was the principle that I saw there that was laid out.
That's right. And along with that, it was a little by little conquest. It wouldn't happen all at once. God said, I'm not going to drive them all out immediately because you guys need time to move into the land, to take over the land, to take over the houses, the fields, and all of those things. So, yeah, but the idea of no covenants with those people, critical.
Yeah. And they kept that. No, they didn't. You're right. Good. Keep me honest. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and that's exactly right, is that they were given rules, weren't they, about how they were to conquer the land. I love it when I read something, I'm 49 years old and I'm reading something, I don't know how many times I've read this, but to see something for the first time kind of after all of that time, but that idea of that gradual taking of the land, I hadn't really thought about that before. But, they were going to go in and they were going to live in houses they didn't build. I'm assuming they were going to harvest crops that they did not plant. Well, if God had just wiped everyone out of the land and said, hey, cleared it out for you, go on in when you're ready, well, they wouldn't have worked for it, first of all. But what would have happened if the land would have been left not tended to, untended? It would have overgrown. There would have been no crops. Houses fall apart when you don't take care of them. We know that, right? And so by doing it the way they did it, they came into a land that was able to better provide for them. I just thought that was fascinating. And that came out of verse 29, out of that section of text, by the way, Exodus 23 and verse 29. And again, I just thought that was fascinating. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone into the land of milk and honey. They would have gone into a barren land that was not kept up. And I just thought that was a very interesting point. All right, any questions about that before we move on to the covenant confirmed? We just got the 1-minute warning, and so we didn't move nearly as fast tonight as we should have.
We're going little by little through
Little
this
by
lesson.
little through the text. That's okay. We've only got 2.5 lessons left. How did Israel respond when they heard the words of the law according to Exodus 24 and verse 3? Just like we talked about on Sunday, didn't we? When they said, "Oh, all that the Lord has said, we will do." And once again, here's their response. All that the Lord has commanded, we will do. And they meant it at the time, but wasn't it the second set of people that they encountered once going into the promised land that they made the covenant with? Am I wrong on that?
So the covenant was reaffirmed. Second group.
No, I'm talking about once they went into the land, the group that came to them and made the covenant that pretended to be from a far-off land.
Yeah, the Gibeonites.
Gibeonites. Very early on in the process, they broke this command that they said all that God had said that they will do. And so, once again, we see their intent. As we talked about on Sunday morning, I think their intent was there. They just didn't carry through very well. We got time for one more anyway. What did Moses do with the words of the law according to Exodus 24 and verse 4? He wrote them down. He wrote down all the... And why is that important? Yeah. All right. Well, I think I don't see any kids yet. We're good? We're good? Yeah. So, I think writing down all of those words was important. They would be preserved.
And, well, here's the question I have. Where is that writing? Where is it? Right here. It's the book of Exodus.
Yeah.
This is it.
Yeah. Not the original.
It's not the original.
But passed down through time. And I think another reason why we can feel that we accurately know what the words of Moses were that were recorded. All right. Well, we are out of time. The kids will be coming down the hall. Appreciate your attention tonight. We will move through this pretty quickly on Sunday morning, and then we'll get into lesson number 11. Thank you so much for your attendance this evening.